In this video, we're going to deal with deindustrialization in the UK. We're going to look at some of the factors that led to deindustrialization and the changing structure of the UK economy. The UK economy has exhibited a substantial deindustrialization over probably the last 30 years. It has radically changed away from manufacturing and towards services. And we need to look into some of the reasons why this may have happened. The switch to a service sector-based economy is typical of many other advanced industrialized economies. It's not just the UK, but it's very pronounced in the UK. It's very obvious what's happened in the UK. The structure of the economy has changed so radically away from its traditional lines. The traditional way of thinking about the UK economy as a manufacturing economy, that has changed radically over, as I said, probably the last 30, maybe even more, 40 years. It's been in the process of change for a long time, but it seems to be accelerating in importance. The virtual stagnation of the manufacturing sector, output only increased by 11.2% in 28 years. So the virtual stagnation of the manufacturing sector has not been seen in other industrialized economies, at least not at that scale. It was very rapid in the UK. The switchover has been very rapid. And this has meant all sorts of issues for the labour market, where people had traditional skills and were no longer required, retraining and trying to reorientate the education system to equip students to cope with the new requirements, which were, as I said, service-based. Computers, services such as hotels and tourism, restaurants, looking at accountancy, insurance, freight work, supplying services to the rest of the world. And that switchover, as I said, was very rapid when it started. The failure of the manufacturing sector is a problem considering the link between the manufacturing and service sectors of the economy. Historically, services provided services to the manufacturing sector. The accountants, the solicitors, the transport people, all of these supplied services to the manufacturing sector. Well, when you take away the manufacturing sector, the service sector has to find new customers and new ways of coping. So the traditional link between manufacturing and services was, in a sense, broken by the collapse or the removal of the manufacturing sector. So leaving the service sector to find new customers, new products, new ways of dealing, and new ways of trading overseas as well. So the causes of this structural change, well, demand and supply changes. Quite simply, the markets change. Markets, supply and demand, those change, and as they change, they lead to structural change. So this could be caused by changes in incomes or in tastes. People have more income, they stop buying traditional goods and start to buy more expensive imports, or they start to buy more elaborate goods. So traditional industry no longer have a customer base. But also tastes change. People have new lifestyles. They don't live like their parents. They live in new ways. And that's constantly evolving. Probably a function of increasing market pressures and advertising and marketing and greater information through the internet and so on. But as we change, and as our tastes change, the demand for more traditional goods from more traditional manufacturing companies, that has fallen away. It's also a change in the age structure of the population. The UK has got an aging population. On average, the average age in the UK is rising. But older people have different demands to younger people. Older people don't necessarily want really fast cars or want a lot of products that younger people would want. Older people don't even perhaps want to buy furniture. They want to spend their money on holidays and on weekend breaks, and they just want to relax. So there's a changing structure leading to a different pattern of expenditure in the economy. Again, moving away from traditional manufacturing products and that type of output. There's also been technological progress and productivity issues. Technologies have changed, and traditional manufacturing, their routines and their processes have changed as a consequence of technological change. The introduction of robotics and the introduction of advanced computer systems and computer-aided manufacturing and so on have changed the ways in which companies operate. It also changes the products that they produce. And to some extent, it enables globalization. In a sense, the skills are incorporated in the technologies and they can be exported, and plants can be set up in other countries where taxation is lower or where the labour force are cheaper to employ. But it could also be related to productivity issues. Perhaps people in the UK were not as productive or didn't want to be as productive. It wasn't that urgent to them. They were more interested in in wider issues like lifestyle and so on, rather than concentrating on just on work and productivity. That may be an issue as well. And of course, globalization and the introduction of international competition and low wage competition damaged manufacturing in the UK. Industry in the UK perhaps had not been investing in the latest technologies or in the latest ways of processing. And new companies set up overseas in other countries would incorporate the latest technology, the latest innovations in production, and hence, of course, be more productive. But also they were working with low wage labour. So put both things together, it meant that UK industry was in trouble. Now, the stage of maturity, well, it's analogous to transfer of workers from the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, a lot of workers came off agriculture and into factories. And again, this is very similar to what's happening here. Workers find perhaps working in heavy industry not attractive. They're not interested in working in noisy, dark, perhaps dirty conditions. They want to move to a more pleasant environment to work. So there's been a transfer away from industry, the cutting face of industry, to perhaps to office work or to retail work which is in a more pleasant environment. So there's been a transfer of workers, and that's happened naturally over a period of time. There's also been a changing pattern of demand. Customers are no longer demanding products which require the services of manufacturing, local manufacturing. When they do require products which are manufactured, they may come from overseas, as I said earlier. They don't have to be produced in the UK. And there's greater acceptance of imports and the importance of imports in the day-to-day running of the economy. So there's a changing pattern of demand. But also there's this idea of the reluctant manufacturing nation. That, as I said earlier, workers are not that keen to work in industry, particularly if it's noisy and dirty and loud and so on. So many workers will opt for clean environments and opt to get different skills which will enable them to work in different environments. Um, the, they're moving, there's a general movement away from manufacturing that it's as if the UK has run its term in terms of manufacturing. It doesn't want it anymore. It has done manufacturing and now has moved on to services and to um, the tertiary sector in general, to banking, insurance, tourism, and so on. So it doesn't want the heavy manufacturing plants anymore. There are other influences. For example, North Sea oil meant a higher exchange rate, which meant cheaper imports. North Sea oil artificially increased the exchange rate because the UK was not importing as much oil as it was previously, which meant the exchange rate was higher in the UK, and it meant that therefore imports were cheaper and exports were of course more expensive, which meant that industry found it difficult to sell overseas. There's also what's known as the crowding out effect. High levels of government expenditure crowded out private sector investment. When the government expands its activities in the economy, it employs people, it borrows money from the financial sector, and it spends the money in the economy, employing, as I said, perhaps specialist workers. But that money is no longer available to be borrowed by the private sector. And the skilled workers have gone to work for the government as opposed to working for industry. So in a sense, government activity has crowded out private activity. It's crowded out the private sector. And this means that there's been a switch away from the private sector towards the public sector. Now we know with the advent of the banking crisis, the government is trying to cut back on its own size. It's trying to cut back the size of the government to create space for the private sector to re-emerge, and trying to get people to set up companies and start to re-engage in perhaps even small-scale manufacturing to try and get back the skills and get back a work ethic in the private sector. But perhaps that's one of the issues. So on this slide, as we've got many important topics which really relate to, some of them, long-term changes in the economy and a changing workforce, a workforce which can decide whether it wants to work in industry or work in the services. Perhaps that decision was not available in the past. People were lucky to get a job in the local factory if they could. Now workers can work in different sectors and acquire the skills to work in different sectors quite easily through the education system, a very sophisticated and developed education system. There's a low productivity vicious circle. We think of low productivity, low output per worker. Low output per worker, of course, means low profits, because the workers are not producing a lot each. So therefore, low productivity means slightly higher prices, which means less demand for the product, less demand, less revenue, less profits. Of course, low profits means low investment, because the companies can't afford to invest. So if the companies can't afford to invest, that means they're less able to keep up with technological change and new developments in production and new types of machine and new types of computer-aided production and so on. So that means the low investment leads to low productivity. And the lower productivity, of course, leads to lower profits. And that's a vicious circle that's downwards. And some people think that's what's happened in the context of the UK. So to sum up, what has caused the deindustrialization of the UK economy? Well, we've listed out various factors that may be responsible. Um, Although it's deindustrialized, the UK economy, in fact, is doing very well compared to other economies. The UK economy, in terms of economic growth, has been very high, and it's outperformed many bigger economies. So, although there's a shift from manufacturing to services, it means the economy is somehow producing more and selling more, even though it's predominantly now based in the service sector. It's very popular for tourism, it's popular for education, it's popular for many products which were seen as peripheral, perhaps, or minor products in the past, and certainly not seen as important as manufacturing. But manufacturing, large-scale manufacturing now has all but closed down in the UK. There still are centres of manufacturing, but overwhelmingly manufacturing has gone. And yet the economy continues to grow and to thrive. It would be bold to pick one explanation as to why the economy has deindustrialized. We've suggested some in terms of the changing desires of the workers to have cleaner work and less arduous work, and the less fashionable parts of industry going, and so on. But that may be an explanation. It may not be universally true. There may be all sorts of issues that lead to deindustrialization. The lack of competitiveness of UK manufacturing appears as a common theme, however. That seems to be mentioned quite a lot in the context of this discussion. It seems as if manufacturing did not invest a lot in its own processes, and that gave capacity for overseas development. Some companies globalized and opened plants elsewhere, or just some countries developed manufacturing based on perhaps a UK model, and they came into competition with the UK manufacturers. The UK manufacturers, with low levels of investment, a very reluctant workforce, reluctant in the sense that they were no longer that interested in manufacturing. They were perhaps moving on towards alternative sources of employment. Low productivity, low investment, it meant the death knell for British manufacturing. Low productivity and high sterling values cannot be discounted as an explanation as well. As I said, low productivity in terms of investment and perhaps also training and career opportunities within manufacturing. These were seen as not very attractive by the workforce, and perhaps the more talented parts of the workforce opted to do other things. And certainly there's been a change in the courses offered at British universities. Many engineering degrees have now closed down because they were expensive to run, and there wasn't simply a big demand for engineering. Many of the sciences have also tragically closed. There's been greater emphasis on commerce, economics, business management, and then some of the professions, accountancy and so on. And these areas have grown in importance. So there are issues that perhaps partially account for what's happened. It's a difficult topic. I think we should be more aware of the fact that it has happened. We have to bear in mind that the UK is doing very well in terms of growth and in terms of a lot of the macroeconomic statistics that show a thriving economy. And it's done this despite the decline in manufacturing. So perhaps it's the case that this is the phase that economies will go through. They go through agriculture, they go through manufacturing, and eventually they go through services. And perhaps other economies will move in the same direction. But that's all we're going to deal with in this session. It's a general chat about deindustrialization and the structure of the UK economy. It's worth noting the various points and it's worth reflecting on them, because this process may not be confined to the UK. It may apply elsewhere, or it may apply elsewhere in the future. It's worth also making notes about it, go back over the video a couple of times as usual, and perhaps do some extra reading in the area to see if the notes can be supplemented and a fuller understanding of the process gained. But that's all I'm going to deal with here, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.